The coin sits wrong in his palm, too light. The emperor stamped on its face is a stranger, and beneath the thin wash of silver, the metal shows gray. A lie his fingers can read. He stands on a broken stretch of wall above the Rhine. The wind shoves through the gaps where mortar used to hold. The granary below is half empty. The barracks leak when it rains. The eagle standard in the camp has lost its gold thread, and the gilt has worn down to brown linen. He swore an oath to that eagle. 25 years of iron and blood. But the Rome that demanded the oath has become a rumor carried by tax collectors who never arrive. And the coin it pays him with is an insult pressed into his hand. This is not the Rome of Augustus, not the Rome of Trajan. This is a corpse still twitching, and he is one of the men picking at it, waiting for the body to go cold. For 5 centuries, Rome ran a machine that built men like him. It took farmers off their fields. It took stonemasons off their scaffolds. It took merchants out of their stalls and broke them down across 25 years, until what walked out the other side was something new. A soldier, yes, but also an engineer, a surveyor, a bridge builder, a killer who knew the geometry of a kill zone. At its height, this machine kept nearly 500,000 of these men under arms. Men who could throw a timber bridge across a river between sunrise and sunset, then erase a city before the next dawn. So what happens when the state that forged the weapon falls apart? The training does not evaporate. The knowledge of how to move grain across 300 miles, how to build a siege tower from green wood, how to hold a shield wall when the man beside you is screaming, none of it leaves the skull that carries it. It stays. Locked inside the most dangerous unemployed generation the world has ever seen. A freelance army of builders and destroyers turned loose on a continent already cracking under its own weight. This is not the story of the Roman legionary fading into the mist. This is the story of what he became when the wages stopped and the eagle fell. What happens when the weapon of order becomes the engine of chaos? When the men trained to hold the frontier are the ones who break it open? The soldiers of the late empire did not just watch their world die, they wrote the next one in their own hand. They took Roman discipline, Roman engineering, Roman hunger for violence, and they hammered a new age out of the rubble. An age of warlords, an age of iron, an age they were built to rule. Tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. And if you believe these buried stories deserve to be told, take a second to subscribe and stand with us. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. It started with a lie dressed in scarlet. A recruiter would ride into a provincial town, his lorica polished to a mirror, his cloak a slash of crimson against the gray stones of the forum. Behind him came a clerk with wax tablets and a stylus, and a soldier holding the standard upright, so the gilt eagle caught the morning sun. The recruiter spoke in the slow rhythm of a man selling salvation. Glory, honor, steady silver every month. A grant of farmland after 25 years of service, enough soil to feed sons and grandsons. Tacitus, writing in his annals, recorded the older bargain. Augustus had fixed the terms back in the years before AD 14, 16 years under the standards. 4 more in the reserve, a discharge bonus of 3,000 denarii. By the time Tiberius came to the throne, the mutineers of Pannonia were already complaining that the years had stretched and the money had shrunk. The lie was old. Only the script was repainted. For a boy whose hands were already cracked from his father's failing plot, a boy whose future was a short life bent over a hoe, the words landed like a hammer on an anvil. He saw the helmet shining in the sun. He did not see the skull that would one day rattle inside it. He saw the future. He did not see the contract that would own his bones. When he stepped forward and pressed his palm to the legion's standard, when his mouth shaped the words of the Sacramentum Militare, something in him died, and he did not know it yet. He swore to obey. He swore to defend the Roman people unto death. He swore not to flee the line. He swore that the safety of the state stood above the safety of his own family. He stopped being a person in that instant. He became inventory, number stamped, century assigned, state property with a heartbeat. His life now had one purpose: to be spent when the emperor needed change. The training that followed was not instruction. It was erasure. The man he had been was scoured off him like rust from iron. Vegetius, writing his De Re Militari in the late 4th century AD, set down the blueprint that had shaped legionaries for generations. 20 miles of march in 5 hours under a sun that cooked the metal on his shoulders, with 60 pounds of gear riding his back. Every day. Not sometimes, every day. The faster pace, the military step, demanded 24 miles in the same 5 hours. Vegetius warned that the man who could not keep that rhythm would be left for the wolves. At nightfall, there was no rest. There was a camp to build, a ditch to dig, 9 feet deep by Polybius's old measure, a rampart to raise from the spoil, sharpened stakes to plant in the earth around the perimeter. Every night, even if the enemy was 300 miles away, the shovel became as familiar to his hand as the sword. Josephus, who watched the legions of Vespasian at work in Judea in AD 67, wrote that their drills were bloodless battles and their battles bloody drills. He learned to cross a river in full armor without sinking. He learned to fell a forest for timber. He learned to lay a road that would still carry traffic 1,000 years after he was dust. He learned to assemble a ballista that could throw a stone the weight of a man across half a mile and turn a wall into gravel. He learned to dig a sap toward an enemy gate, while archers tried to kill him through the wicker hurdle above his head. His weapons training was not the romance the recruiter had promised. It was a science of slaughter, broken down to its smallest parts, and drilled until his arms moved without his mind. He swung a wooden sword that weighed twice what the gladius would weigh in battle. He carried a wicker shield twice as heavy as the scutum. The point was simple. When the day came that the iron was in his hand, it would feel weightless. He did not learn to fight with flourish. He learned one motion: a short, upward thrust, into the groin, into the soft belly under the ribs. 2 inches of steel kills a man as well as 2 feet, and it lets you pull back fast and find the next throat. Vegetius wrote it plain. A cut wound, however deep, rarely kills. A stab 2 inches in is mortal. No wide swings, no heroics, no wasted breath. Kill, step, kill. For 25 years, this was his trade. He became something the world had never built before. A man who could lay an aqueduct on Monday and erase a village on Tuesday. A human tool with 100 edges. His loyalty was not love of country. His loyalty was muscle memory and payday. And the first crack in him did not come from a sword. It came from a coin. In the early empire, the silver denarius was a piece of the imperial promise made solid. Pure metal. Honest weight. Under Augustus, the coin ran at roughly 98% silver. A coin a soldier could send home and know it would feed his mother through winter. A coin that, multiplied over a quarter century, became a farm. Nero began the slow theft in AD 64. He shaved the weight. He cut the purity to 93%. Suetonius noted the emperor's hunger for revenue and his contempt for old standards. After Nero, the door stayed open. Trajan reached in. Marcus Aurelius reached in deeper to pay for the wars on the Danube. By the reign of Septimius Severus, the denarius was barely 50% silver. By Gallienus in the 260s AD, the so-called silver coin was a copper slug with a wash, thin enough to rub off on a wet thumb. Civil wars had bled the treasury dry. Between AD 235 and 284, the empire ate through more than 20 emperors, most of them murdered by their own troops. Corruption had eaten what was left. Emperors who could not afford the army they needed turned to the oldest fraud in the world. Picture the soldier returning from a patrol across the Danube. The forest there smells of cold pine sap and wet iron. The mist clings to the horse's flanks until midday. 2 men from his contubernium had been dragged off their horses that morning by Gothic raiders. He had heard the sounds they made. He carries those sounds home with him, lodged somewhere behind his teeth. He lines up for his stipendium outside the Principia, the headquarters tent in the center of the fort. The paymaster sits on a stool with a wax tablet on his knee, calling names. He drops a leather pouch into the soldier's palm. He opens it. The coins look like silver in the firelight. They do not feel like silver. The weight is wrong. He scrapes one against a stone, and there it is, the dull bronze gleam under the skin of the wash. The lie made visible. The bread vendor in the camp wants 3 of these coins for a loaf that cost one a year ago. The wine has been cut with water, and the leather to fix his boots costs more than a week's pay. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, posted on stone in AD 301, tried to freeze the bleeding with the threat of death for overcharging. It failed within a year. The merchants vanished. The black markets opened. Nothing went home. Nothing was saved. He bled for a treasury that was robbing him in the same breath. This was not one bad year. It was a slow rot that crawled through the legions, fort by fort, season by season. Loyalty is not free. It has a price. When the price stopped being paid in real silver, the loyalty started corroding too. Then came the second betrayal, and this one cut deeper than the coin. He looked at the centurion barking orders at him, the man whose vinstick, the vitis, could shatter a forearm and leave a man pissing blood for a week. The Latin coming out of that mouth was thick now, shaped by a different tongue. Gothic vowels, Frankish consonants, the accent of the very peoples he had spent his youth being trained to kill. He looked higher up the chain. The Magister Militum, the supreme commander of the Western armies under the boy Emperor Honorius, was a Vandal. His name was Stilicho. His father had served Valens as a cavalry officer. He had married Serena, the niece of Theodosius the Great. He held the West together with one hand for over a decade. The man standing shoulder to shoulder with our soldier in the shield wall was an Alan. The cavalry sweeping the flank were Sarmatians from beyond the Black Sea. The barbarians were no longer across the river. They were his officers, his comrades, his superiors. The legions, hollowed out by the Antonine Plague in the 160s AD, then again by the Plague of Cyprian after AD 249, and gutted further by the slow demographic collapse of the western provinces, had thrown their gates open to anyone who could swing a sword. Germanic warriors, steppe horsemen, Hunnic auxiliaries hired by the wagon load after AD 380. Anyone with a working arm and a willingness to take Roman pay. The word Roman began to dissolve in his mouth. It used to mean blood. It used to mean a city, a language, a senate, 1,000 years of ancestors buried beneath the same roads. Caracalla's edict of AD 212, the Constitutio Antoniniana, had already cracked the meaning open by handing citizenship to every free man in the empire. Now, it meant a uniform, a job, a paycheck that could not be cashed. The old citizen soldier from Hispania or Gaul looked at these new men with a mix of fear and contempt. They fought hard. He respected the way they killed, but they did not fight for Rome. They fought for the man who led them. Loyalty had stopped being a thing owed to an institution. It was personal now. It belonged to the general who learned your name, who fed you, who promised you a fat share of the next town's silver. Consider Arbogast, a Frank by blood. He rose through the Western army in the 380s AD and ended up the real power behind the throne of the puppet emperor Eugenius. When Theodosius killed him at the Battle of the Frigidus in AD 394, the lesson was not lost on the next generation of barbarian officers. Power flowed not from Rome, but from the men with swords in their hands. Stilicho learned it. Alaric learned it. Ricimer would learn it. Odoacer would learn it last. The army was breaking into pieces from the inside out. Each piece pledged to a different strongman. And the soldier on the cold frontier found himself with a question he could not say aloud. Did he owe his life to a faceless emperor in a marble palace 1,000 miles away? An emperor whose coin was a fake? Or did he owe it to the Gothic warlord who fought beside him in the mud, who paid him in real gold solidly struck from Constantinople's mint? Who could keep him alive through the next winter? The answer was not a betrayal. It was arithmetic. Rome, the idea was dying in the imperial documents. Rome, the war band, was being born in the camps. Then came the final insult. The policy of foederati. It had been the desperate fix of Theodosius after the catastrophe at Adrianople in AD 378, where the Emperor Valens had been killed and 2/3 of the Eastern army had been butchered by the Goths in a single afternoon. Ammianus Marcellinus, the last great historian of Rome, wrote that nothing comparable to the slaughter had been seen since the disaster of Cannae. The empire could not replace those men, so it hired the men who had killed them. To the politicians in Ravenna and Constantinople, it looked like a brilliant solution. Why bother training Romans when you could hire whole nations to fight for you? Settle the Visigoths inside the borders after the Treaty of AD 382. Feed them, arm them, give them land in Moesia and Thrace. Let them defend the empire as allies bound by foedus, by treaty. To the soldiers standing on a crumbling wall in Pannonia, where the wind off the Danube cut through the cracks in the mortar, and the only sound at night was the cough of the sentries, it was the final knife. He watched as the Goths received the farmland he had been promised for his retirement. He watched the imperial wagons roll past his half-rations and dump grain in the camps of men he had spent his life being trained to kill. He had to keep the peace in territories that now legally belonged to his enemies. And he saw them up close. He saw what was happening. They were learning. They were watching the legions drill. They were copying the armor, the formations, the engineering, the supply systems. They were taking notes in their heads. The young Alaric himself had served as a Roman officer under Theodosius at the Frigidus, commanded Gothic auxiliaries on the Roman side, and walked away from that battlefield with everything he needed to bring the empire down. They served beside the Roman ranks long enough to map every weakness. They were not allies. They were a virus the empire had injected into its own veins with both hands. The hatred in the frontier camps thickened like blood in cold water. Every morning the soldier looked across the river at the free barbarians who might kill him by sundown. Then he turned around and looked at the privileged barbarians who had been given his land by his own emperor. He was being crushed between them, and the empire was holding the press. He was a stranger in his own legion, a ghost in a fortress that no longer remembered why it was built, a tool being used to sharpen the axe that would split the empire's neck. For those of us who walk this far into the dark with me, there is a kind of unspoken kinship. We are not here for entertainment. We are here to understand the machinery that grinds civilizations into bone meal. If that pull lives in you, if the abyss looks back and you stare harder, then I want you in our inner circle. It is called the lineage. Members do more than support the channel. They fund the research, the long nights, the deep digs into archives most people never open. They get the investigations first, before anyone. Join the ranks, become part of the lineage, and help us keep this fire burning. The break, when it finally came, did not arrive as thunder. It came as a tremor that started far to the south and traveled north along the roads the legions themselves had built. The setup had been laid 2 years earlier. In August AD 408, at Ravenna, the eunuch courtier Olympius had whispered into the ear of the boy Emperor Honorius until the emperor signed the death warrant of Stilicho. The general who had held the West together was beheaded at the church where he had taken sanctuary. His son Eucharius was hunted down and murdered shortly after. The wives and children of 30,000 barbarian soldiers serving in the Roman army were then slaughtered in the cities where they had been quartered as hostages of good behavior. Those 30,000 men fled across the Apennines and joined Alaric. The Goths now had a Roman-trained corps large enough to take a city. Alaric marched south. He besieged Rome 3 times. He cut the grain ships from Portus. The Senate, starving, sent envoys. Zosimus, the pagan historian writing a century later, preserved the conversation. The envoys boasted that the Roman people were many and ready to fight. Alaric laughed and answered, "The thicker the hay, the easier it is to mow." AD 410, August, a rider came into the camp on the Rhine on a horse foamed white at the bit. His face was the color of wet ash. He had not slept in 3 days. He carried news, and the news cracked the air when he said it. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, the same Visigoths the empire had invited in, and armed and fed at its own table, had stood at the Salarian gate on the night of the 24th. The gate had opened from the inside. A slave, the sources say, maybe Anicia Faltonia Proba, the richest woman in Rome, ordered it opened to spare her household the famine. The Goths poured in by torchlight. For 3 days, they took what they wanted. Rome had been sacked. The word moved through the barracks like a ghost. The dice stopped rolling. The drunken arguments at the fires died mid-sentence. Men who had not prayed in 20 years made the sign of old gods under their breath. Some wept. Most did not. A centurion outside the Principia sat down on the bench by the gate and stared at his hands as if he had never seen them before. Rome, not a frontier town, not a provincial capital. Rome itself. The city that had stood for 800 years since Brennus, the Gaul last took her in 390 BC, the heart the soldier had sworn his oath to defend. St. Jerome, hearing the news in his cell in Bethlehem, would write that his voice clung to his throat and sobs choked his words. The city that had taken the whole world had been taken, and the emperor had done nothing. Honorius, safe behind the marshes of Ravenna, had reportedly mistaken the messenger's news for the death of his favorite rooster, also named Roma. When told it was the city, he sighed in relief. The story is from Procopius. It may be a slander. It may be true. The soldiers on the Rhine did not need to know which. The emperor had not come. That was enough. The soldier stood there with his worthless coin in his pocket and felt the floor of the world give way beneath his boots. If the emperor could not save Rome, he could not save a fort on the Rhine. He could not pay him. He could not feed him. He could not bury him. The oath was ash. The contract was void. The empire was a word people still said out of habit. Every soldier was his own general now. Every legion was its own kingdom. The machine had been pulled loose from the hand that built it. It was still sharp, it was still trained, it was still hungry, and it was about to choose who would feed it next. The machine did not rust. A weapon shaped over 500 years does not forget its edge, because the hand that held its leash has been buried. The Roman soldier without a Rome became the most dangerous variable left on the chessboard of the West. He could kill. He could build. He could move grain 300 miles across hostile country. He could read terrain like other men read faces. He could set a broken leg, draw a map from memory, smelt an iron blade, identify a poisoned well by smell. He was a professional surrounded by amateurs. When the central authority that gave his life its shape evaporated, he did not stack his weapons and walk into a field. He found a new master. Sometimes the new master was the man in the bronze mirror. 4 roads opened in front of him. Each one led deeper into the long red dusk that historians would later call the Dark Ages. Each one was a different answer to the same question. What does a predator do when the cage dissolves around it? The first road was not desertion. It was privatization. Across the bleeding provinces of Gaul and Hispania, whole units refused to disband. They had the iron, they had the drill. They were stationed in countryside where no tax collector had ridden in a decade, and no governor had been seen in 2. They looked at the chaos and they did not see a problem. They saw a market. They became known as the Bagaudae. The name first appears under the reign of Diocletian, when the Emperor Maximian was sent west in AD 285 to put down their first great rising in Armorica, the peninsula we now call Brittany. The campaign is recorded in the Latin panegyrics, where the court orator Mamertinus praised Maximian for crushing what he called a rebellion of farmers and slaves. He did not finish them. He could not finish them. They went quiet, then rose again under the Magister Militum Aetius in the 430s and 440s AD, when a man named Tibato led the Armorican Bagaudae in open revolt. Aetius sent Goar and his Alan cavalry against them. The chronicler Hydatius records the bloodshed in a few cold lines. He does not record the names of the dead. There were too many. The chronicler Salvian of Marseille, writing his De Gubernatione Dei around AD 440, said something the imperial court did not want recorded. He wrote that the peasants fled to the Bagaudae not because they were criminals, but because Roman taxes had become worse than barbarian raids. He wrote that the rich devoured the poor and called it civilization. He wrote that the only freedom left in Gaul was outside the law. The court in Ravenna called them brigands. The reality was harder to swallow. They were ex-legionaries running their territories like a business. They were applying the Roman military manual to organized extortion at the scale of a province. When they moved on a town, they did not move to burn it. They moved to acquire it. They rolled their onagers and ballistae into position on the high ground at dawn, the same artillery they had been trained to use against Sarmatian hill forts on the Tissa. The wooden frames creaked as the Torsian springs of twisted sinew were wound by 4 men on a capstan. A stone, the weight of a calf, sat in the cradle. The morning smelled of pine resin from the timber, and of horse from the cavalry pickets, and of the open latrine pit at the edge of the camp. The town watched from the parapet and counted the engines and did the arithmetic. Then the leader walked out alone under a green branch. He was a former centurion most days, or a decurion of cavalry, a man whose vinstic scar still ran across his palm and whose left ear had been notched in some forgotten skirmish on the Rhine. He spoke to the elders in clean Latin, the Latin of the parade ground and the legal code. He explained that the emperor could not protect them anymore. He named the Frankish war bands raiding south of the Loire under chieftains like Clodio. He named the Saxon ships beaching on the coast of the Tractus Armoricanus. He offered a contract, a tax paid quarterly in grain and coin and worked iron. In exchange, his men would walk the walls at night, patrol the river road as far as the next milestone, and escort the harvest to market under armed cover. They would settle disputes between merchants. They would hang horse thieves on the same trees the Romans had used. It was the empire in miniature, built from its broken parts, run by its forgotten sons. A landowner who refused to pay woke to find his granary smoking and his overseer nailed to the gate by his palms. A wine merchant who tried to slip past their toll booth on the road to Bordeaux was found 3 days later swinging from an oak, with his purse still on his belt as a message. The message was simple. The receipt was kept. They were not bandits. They were a state in larval form. Their standards were not the eagles of the legions. They carried whatever sign their captain favored. A wolf's head, a red hand, a bronze ox. The eagle had flown. Something else now hunted the same sky. Some of them grew strange. In Hispania, Tarraconensis, around AD 449, a Bagaudic leader named Basilius captured the city of Tiriasso, modern Tarazona. He killed the local Federate troops inside their barracks. He dragged the bishop, a man named Leo, out of his church and butchered him at the altar. The act was recorded by Hydatius with a single sentence that carries more weight than a page. The men who had once defended Roman bishops were now murdering them in their own naves. The second road was the road of the kingmaker. To the war chiefs pressing against the empire's hide from every side, a Roman officer who could be bought was worth more than 10 wagons of gold. The Franks under Childeric had numbers. The Burgundians under Gundioch had ferocity. The Visigoths under Theodoric had cavalry. None of them had the science. A Frankish king could lead a screaming charge into a shield wall and break it with his own axe. He could not calculate the angle of fire for an artillery piece. He could not plan a 4-week siege without his army starving before the defenders did. He could not lay out a marching camp that would not flood in the first hard rain. He could not move 10,000 men from the Rhine to the Loire without losing half of them to dysentery from bad water. He could not read. A Roman centurion could do all of it. The knowledge was burned into him by 20 years of drill. The Strategikon, a military manual written in Greek at the end of the 6th century AD and attributed to the Emperor Maurice, preserves what these men knew. It speaks of ambush dispositions, of how to deploy cavalry against the Avars, of how long to march before resting the men. It is the late echo of a knowledge that had once been kept alive by every centurion's tongue. Picture a hill above the city of Soissons in northern Gaul. The year is somewhere in the late 480s AD. Clovis, son of Childeric, stands at the crest with his retainers around him. He is 20-some years old. He is missing 2 teeth on the left side from a Saxon blade taken near Tournai. His war braids are tied with strips of red leather. A gold ring sits on his right thumb, taken from the body of a Thuringian noble 3 summers ago. His warriors squat on their heels behind him, eating cold pork from a slaughtered ox, watching the city's stone walls and the spear points moving along the parapet. They can burn the fields. They cannot crack the city. The treasure they want is inside. A man is led up the hill. A Roman, by his Latin and his haircut, and the manner in which he meets the king's eye without flinching. He had been an engineer with the Legionaries of the Loire frontier. He has watched the wind, and he has chosen his side. He kneels in the wet grass. He asks for a stick. He draws in the mud at the king's feet. He sketches a siege tower on rollers, covered in green hides soaked in vinegar to resist fire. He sketches a ram with an iron head, sheltered under a sloped roof of wicker and wet leather called a testudo. He shows them where the wall of Soissons is thinnest, on the western face where the bedrock dips and the foundation runs shallow. He explains that the gate towers can be blinded by archers shooting from a wooden screen rolled up to within 50 paces. He explains how to dig a sap under the wall by night, propping the tunnel with timber, then firing the props so the wall above collapses into the void. This was the technique the Romans had used at Masada in AD 73. The Romans had learned it from the Macedonians. The Macedonians had learned it from the Persians. The chain of inheritance was now passing into Frankish hands. He organizes the camp. He sets the latrines downstream of the wells. He posts pickets in rotating watches of 4 hours. He divides the army into commissary units of 8 men, the old Roman contubernium, each with 1 mule and 1 tent. He sends scouts in pairs, 1 literate and 1 not, so that no man can read his own orders or sell them. He turns a war band into an army. This was the secret the chronicles did not write down in plain ink. The fall of the West was not a wave of barbarian numbers drowning Roman skill. It was an intellectual transfer. The empire's most lethal knowledge, the cumulative engineering of 500 years of war, leaked out across the frontier in the heads of men who had decided that a barbarian king who paid in real gold was a better employer than an emperor who paid in copper slugs. They did not just join the enemy. They upgraded the enemy. They became the architects of their own people's burial. The third road was the road of the last Roman. In the vacuum, certain Roman commanders refused to fold. They cut out their own territories and called them what they had always been called: Roman. The most famous of these was the Rump Kingdom in northern Gaul, ruled by Syagrius, the son of Aegidius. His father had been a magister militum under the Emperor Majorian in the late 450s AD. Majorian had been the last serious soldier on the Western throne, a man who had marched into Gaul to reclaim it and who was preparing an invasion of Vandal Africa from Cartagena in AD 460. The patrician Ricimer, a Suevic Visigothic general who ran the empire from behind the curtain, had him intercepted, stripped of his purple, and executed on the bank of the river Iria on August 7, AD 461. Aegidius refused to accept the new puppet Ravenna installed. He kept his army. He kept his territory between the Loire and the Somme. He kept the title Magister Militum per Gallius as if Majorian still lived. When he died, possibly poisoned in AD 464 or 465, his son Syagrius inherited the experiment. From a distance, it looked noble, the candle of Rome flickering in the Gaulish dark. Up close, it was something else. Syagrius was a warlord. His army was a stew of regulars who had not been paid by Rome in 20 years. Frankish mercenaries on personal contract under Childeric, Alan cavalry settled around Orleans by old imperial decree of Aetius, and local levies pressed into service by his estate managers. The Latin documents still rolled out of his chancery in Soissons. The coins still bore the proper formulas, the imperial titles, the cross of Christ. The reality was a strong man holding ground with a private army. Gregory of Tours, writing his Historia Francorum a century later in the 580s and 590s AD, called Syagrius Rex Romanorum, King of the Romans. The title was new. There had not been a Roman king since Tarquinius Superbus was driven out by Brutus in 509 BC. a memory the Romans had treated as sacred for nearly 1,000 years. The word betrayed the change. Syagrius wore the toga of a magistrate, but ruled like any Frankish warlord on his border. Clovis came for him in AD 486. He was 20 years old. His father Childeric had been buried 2 years earlier at Tournai. His grave packed with 300 gold coins, a severed horse's head, a crystal globe, and a B-shaped fibula that would resurface 1,500 years later in the coronation robes of Napoleon. Clovis inherited the warband and the grudge. The two armies met near Soissons on ground the chronicles do not name. Gregory gives us no description of the fighting, just the result. Syagrius's line broke. He fled south to the court of the Visigothic king Alaric II at Toulouse, asking sanctuary in the proper Roman fashion. Alaric II weighed the price of harboring him against the price of angering the rising Frankish king. And the math was simple. He bound Syagrius in chains, loaded him onto a wagon, and handed him back to Clovis. Gregory says Clovis had him killed quietly. A knife in a cell. No witnesses, no ceremony. The last Roman state in Gaul did not end with a heroic last stand on a wall. It ended with a private execution in a back room, conducted on the orders of one warlord and at the request of another. Gregory also gives us the famous story of what happened next. At the division of the plunder taken from the cities of Syagrius, a beautiful silver ewer had been taken from a church at Rheims. The bishop, a man named Remigius, asked Clovis to return it. Clovis agreed and tried to claim it as part of his personal share. A common soldier struck the ewer with his Francisca axe and shouted that the king would have nothing but what the lot fairly gave him. Clovis said nothing. He let the soldier live. A year later, at the spring muster on the parade ground at Soissons, Clovis inspected that same man's weapons, found them rusted, threw the man's axe on the ground, and as the soldier bent to retrieve it, split the man's skull with his own. As he wiped his blade, Clovis said, "Thus you did to the ewer at Soissons." The story was a lesson. The new king ruled by Roman discipline now. The old freedoms of the warband were ending, and the army of Syagrius? Clovis did not put them to the sword. He was not stupid. The officers, the engineers, the men who knew how to lay a road and dig a sap were worth more breathing than dead. They swore a new oath. They drew new pay. The work continued. Only the letterhead changed. So much of what we can still reconstruct about this twilight comes from a handful of texts that survived the long burning. The book that anchors today's investigation is one of those rare pieces of dark scholarship that strips away the romance and shows the soldier at the end of his world for what he actually was. It is on the shelf right now behind the View Products button on your screen. Tap it. While you are there, walk the rest of the shelf. We have curated a small armory of relics and immersive objects tied to this era. Pieces that put the texture of late Rome into your hand. Open the shop, browse the artifacts, then come back to me. The descent continues. The fourth road was the quietest. It was also the road that ran longest, because it ran all the way into the next 1,000 years. As the imperial post stopped delivering, as the bandits multiplied on the roads, as the cities shrank inside their late Roman walls, and grass grew through the cracks in the forum at Arles, the great senatorial landowners discovered something unpleasant. The villa rustica that had been a country retreat for their grandfathers had become a target. The latifundia, the vast agricultural estates of southern Gaul and Italy and Hispania, sat surrounded by hungry men with sharp tools. The legions were gone. The taxes that had once paid the legions could now be kept by the man who owned the land. A useful exchange except that the money meant nothing if the granary burned. The aristocrats had wealth. The countryside had unemployed killers. The transaction wrote itself. The villas began to grow walls. Sidonius Apollinaris, the Gallo-Roman bishop and aristocrat writing from his estate at Avatacum near Clermont-Ferrand in the 470s AD, describes in his letters how his neighbors fortified their grounds. Watchtowers on the gateposts, stone curtain walls where the gardens used to stretch, ditches dug along the perimeter where the orchards had stood. The Lord's Hall began to look like a small fort, because that is what it had become. Sidonius himself organized the defense of Clermont when the Visigothic king Euric besieged it through the winters of AD 471 to 474. He wrote letters to other Gallo-Roman bishops, begging for relief that never came. The emperor Julius Nepos signed the city away to Euric in AD 475 in exchange for peace. Sidonius was arrested by the Goths, held at the fortress of Livia near Carcassonne, and only released when he wrote a flattering poem to Euric. The bishop-poet ended his career as a courtier of the men who had taken his city. He died around AD 489 in a Gaul that no longer answered to Rome. Inside those fortified walls, the aristocrat hired the best private soldiers his money could buy. The Roman veteran paid in land instead of debased copper. The oath changed shape. The Sacramentum Militare had been sworn to the emperor and to the Roman people. The new oath, the Fidelitas, was sworn to a man, to a face, to a hall. The soldier laid his hands between the Lord's hands, the gesture called immixtio manuum, that would later become the heart of feudal homage and promised loyalty until death. The Lord promised protection, a roof, bread, a share of the harvest, and a parcel of land worked by tenants whose labor now passed to the soldier as part of his pay. These tenants were the colony, men legally bound to the soil by the late imperial laws of Constantine and Theodosius, men who had been peasants under Rome and would be serfs under the new lords without ever leaving the same fields. This was the seed of feudalism, planted in the soil of a dying empire and watered with the blood of a dying army. The legionary became the household warrior. The household warrior became the retainer. The retainer became the knight. The estate became the manor. The manor became the lordship. The lordship became the kingdom. The grand promise of the recruiter, made in the Forum so many decades ago, finally came true in the most twisted form possible. The soldier got his farm. He got his patch of earth at the end of his service. He got it not from a grateful senate, but from a private lord whose great-grandfather had been a Roman senator, and whose great-grandson would be a feudal count signing his name with an X. The price was the world he had been built to defend. He was not a citizen anymore. There was no city to be a citizen of. He was a vassal. His sword no longer rose for the eagle. It rose for the man who fed him. And across what had been the empire, from the Pyrenees to the Rhine to the moors of Britain, 10,000 other men were swearing the same oath, in the same hall, to the same kind of master. A new order was being stitched together out of the corpse of the old. The thread was personal loyalty. The needle was the gladius. And somewhere in the dark of that long 5th century, in a watchtower over a fortified villa in the Auvergne, a veteran of 40 winters polished his helmet by lamplight and waited for a sound he had been trained his whole life to recognize. The sound came that night. Hooves on the road. Many of them. Moving fast. Not friendly. The barking of the estate dogs cut off one by one as the riders passed. A horn somewhere in the dark. 2 long notes. A signal he did not know. He set the helmet on his head and reached for the sword. The kingdoms that grew from the carcass of the West did not arrive with torches and a clean slate. The Franks in Gaul under Clovis, the Visigoths in Hispania under Alaric II, and later Leovigild, who would move his capital to Toledo around AD 569 and stamp his coins with the imperial diadem. The Vandals in North Africa under Gaiseric, who had crossed from Tarifa to Tangier in May AD 429 with 80,000 of his people, marched east along the coast for 10 years and seized Carthage in October AD 439, turning it into the capital of a pirate state whose ships would sack Rome itself 16 years later under that same king, now an old man with gray braids. The Ostrogoths in Italy under Theodoric, who had ruled at Ravenna since AD 493 after personally killing the warlord Odoacer at a banquet in the palace of the Lauritum, splitting him from collarbone to hip with a single stroke, and joking afterward that the man must have had no bones. These were not the savages of imperial propaganda. They were inheritors. They had grown up inside or alongside the empire. Theodoric had been raised in Constantinople as a hostage from the age of 7, sent in AD 461 as a condition of the treaty between his father Theudemir and the Emperor Leo. He spent 10 years in the imperial palace at the Bucaleon, schooled in Greek by tutors who had taught the sons of senators, watching how the Eastern bureaucracy moved paper from desk to desk. Clovis had been baptized at Rheims by Bishop Remigius on Christmas Day, probably in AD 508, in the same baptistery whose foundations still lie beneath the cathedral floor. Gregory of Tours preserves the moment. 3,000 of his warriors entered the water with him, the candles guttering against the cold stone, the bishop's voice steady, the king bowing his head as Remigius said the famous line, "Bow your neck, proud Sicambrian. Burn what you have adored. Adore what you have burned." These men did not want to torch the machine. They wanted the keys. They moved through the wreckage of Roman administration the way a new owner walks through a bought factory. The looms still worked. The forges still smoked. The granaries still had records of who owed what. Only the signs above the doors needed changing. A Roman officer who had commanded a garrison for Syagrius was given a clean choice the morning after Soissons fell. Swear the new oath to Clovis, or have your throat opened in the courtyard before breakfast. Most chose the oath. Their loyalty had never belonged to a dead emperor. It had belonged to their craft. The transition was seamless and red. The same veterans who had defended the towns of the Loire against Frankish raiders the year before were now manning those same walls against Visigothic raids the next year, wearing the same mail, drawing the same weapons from the same imperial armories. The state weapons factories, the Fabricae, had been mapped in detail in the Notitia Dignitatum, the great administrative register compiled around AD 400. 20 Fabricae are listed across the western prefectures. The Fabrica at Augustodunum, modern Autun, had specialized in ballistae. The one at Argentomegus had produced shields. The one at Soissons had forged blades. The one at Cremona in northern Italy had cast helmet bowls in a single piece. The wheels did not stop. They simply turned for a new owner. Theodoric kept these workshops running. The Variae of Cassiodorus, the collected letters Cassiodorus drafted on the king's behalf between AD 506 and 537, preserve actual administrative orders. One letter instructs the Count of Como to ensure the prompt delivery of shields and javelins from the local fabrica. Another orders the repair of the aqueduct at Ravenna. Another regulates the price of grain. Read them in sequence, and they could have been written by any prefect of any earlier century. The hand that drafted them had served Theodoric. The Latin in which they were written had served Rome since Cicero. The gladius gave way to the longer spatha, the cavalry sword the late Roman army had already adopted by the 3rd century AD, and the great rectangular scutum gave way to the round shield, and the change happened so gradually inside the same workshops that no one alive could mark the day the empire stopped making them. The new armies of the 6th and 7th centuries AD were not barbarian war bands wearing Roman armor as costume. They were hybrids, discipline grafted onto ferocity, siege engineering grafted onto raiding skill, Frankish levies fighting in ordered ranks under counts who had inherited the title from Roman comes, Visigothic horsemen riding in formations drilled by men whose grandfathers had served on the Persian frontier. The Lombards, who would cross into Italy in AD 568 under Alboin, would adopt the Roman system of duchies almost intact, ruling from cities like Pavia and Spoleto and Benevento that had been Roman administrative centers for half a millennium. The legion did not die. It was eaten and absorbed, and its DNA moved into the bloodstream of its eaters. The same cannibalization wrote itself across the soil of Europe in stone. The vast lattice of Roman fortification, the physical skeleton of imperial power, did not collapse into picturesque ivy-covered ruin. It was seized, refurbished, and inverted. A Roman fort built to control a ford on the Mosel or a pass through the Cottian Alps did not become a sleepy hamlet. It became a castle. The veteran stationed there, the man who knew which stone in the wall had been laid by his own century back in the days of pay and order, simply stayed. He became the first castellan. He became the keeper of the gate. But the gate now served a different logic. Under Rome, the fort had existed to keep the road open, to guarantee that the cursus publicus, the imperial post, could ride from Lugdunum to Colonia Agrippina without paying a copper to anyone along the way. The post used relay stations called mutationes every 8 to 12 miles and mansions every 30, where a courier could change horses, eat a hot meal, sleep on a bed of straw, and be back on the road before dawn, to ensure the grain barges moved upstream on the Rhone. The Roman frontier system, the limes, was a circulatory network. It was designed to let blood flow through the body of the empire. Under the new lords, the gate became a choke point. A chain was hauled across the river at dawn. The hinges of the gate, oiled with mutton fat, groaned as the bar was lifted. A toll was collected from every barge. A merchant who refused to pay had his cargo seized, and his bargemen flogged across the back with a knotted rope until they crawled. The road that had been built to bind a world together was repurposed to squeeze it. The Pax Romana inverted. The defensive web became an extractive web. Every keep on a hill became a tooth in the jaw that fed on the surrounding countryside. The medieval landscape of 10,000 castles that older historians once treated as a new invention was nothing of the kind. It was the Roman military frontier, reanimated, turned inward, and given a new appetite. The stones were Roman. The mortar, mixed with brick dust and volcanic ash in the proportions Vitruvius had specified in the 1st century BC, was Roman. The geometry of the walls, the playing card outline with rounded corners that had been standard since the late 3rd century AD, was Roman. Only the banner had changed, and the banner did not care. In the wreckage of secular authority, one institution still stood with its hierarchy intact, its records preserved, its couriers still moving on the roads: the Church. As governors fled and prefects vanished, bishops became the de facto magistrates of their cities. They negotiated with the new kings. They paid ransoms in church silver. They organized food in famine. Sidonius Apollinaris had done it at Clermont through the sieges of Uruk. Germanus had done it at Auxerre, even leading a militia of Britons to victory in the so-called Alleluia victory against Saxons and Picts around AD 429. The ambush sprung in a narrow valley, with the Britons shouting Alleluia 3 times until the echo from the hills convinced the raiders that a huge army was upon them. They fled without a fight. Severinus had done it along the Danube in Noricum in the 470s AD, walking unarmed into the camps of the Rugi to ransom captives with chalices melted down for the purpose. The Vita Severini, written by his disciple Eugippius around AD 511, reads like the diary of a frontier commander as much as a saint. It records the weather, the river levels, the names of the chiefs across the water. Pope Leo I had done the same thing at the highest level. In AD 452, when Attila and his Hun army stood on the river Mincio in northern Italy, with Rome itself open before them, the Western Emperor Valentinian III sent the Bishop of Rome to negotiate. Leo rode out with a small embassy. What was said between them is unknown. Attila turned around. Prosper of Aquitaine, writing his chronicle within a year of the event, says the Hun was moved by the bishop's bearing. Other sources whisper of plague in the Hun camp and tribute paid in gold. Either way, the man in the white robe had done what the legions could no longer do. Into this surviving hierarchy walked a particular kind of recruit. The Roman officer was a man shaped by command. He knew how to manage 100 men in close quarters. He knew how to enforce a roster. He knew how to handle supplies without theft. He knew how to wake a sleeping unit before dawn and have them on the road within an hour. The skills that had made him a centurion translated almost without friction into the skills of an abbot. The Rule of Saint Benedict, composed at Monte Cassino around AD 540 by a man who had abandoned his studies in Rome and walked away from the wreck of senatorial life, reads like a duty roster lifted from a legionary fort. Hours are fixed. Tasks are assigned. Silence is enforced at meals. Disobedience is punished by escalating stages, beginning with private rebuke, moving to public reprimand, then to excommunication from the common table, then to corporal punishment, then to expulsion. The abbot's authority is absolute and his decisions cannot be appealed. Benedict opens his rule by calling his monks Milites Christi, soldiers of Christ. He calls the monastery a school of the Lord's service. He was not writing in metaphor. He was writing in muscle memory. His own family had been provincial Roman gentry from Nursia in the Sabine Hills. The bones of the empire ran through his Latin. When he wrote that a monk should sleep in his clothes and his belt so as to be ready at any hour, he was describing a watch rotation he had not invented. He had inherited it. Cassiodorus, the senator who had served as praetorian prefect under Theodoric and then withdrew from politics to found his monastery at Vivarium in Calabria in the 550s AD, set his monks to copying manuscripts the way a quartermaster sets men to inventory. He drew up a list of texts to be preserved. He commissioned shelves. He standardized the calligraphy. He saved more classical literature than any battle ever destroyed. The works of Cicero, of Tacitus in part, of Quintilian, of countless others, came down through medieval Europe because Cassiodorus had been trained to administer a kingdom and spent his second life administering a library. He died around AD 585, in his mid-90s, still writing. The Church became the Shadow Empire. It kept the Latin. It kept the chain of command. It kept the records and the roads of correspondence. The papal scrinium, the archive, preserved letters going back to the 3rd century AD. The Christmas dating of liturgical years tracked the same indictions the late Roman tax system had used. The Church offered the disbanded legionary a new banner to march under and a new war to fight, a war against sin and chaos and the appetites of his own body, fought with the same tools of obedience and routine that had once been used to break Sarmatian cavalry on the Danube. The legion was now wearing a habit, and the last soldier of Rome, the man whose grandfather had taken the sacramentum under Honorius and whose father had served under a Frankish count, did not get the death the recruiter had promised. He did not die in a sunlit field at 60, with a stone farmhouse and grown sons climbing the olive tree his pension had bought. That promise had been ash before he was born. He died in a ditch outside a town in the Auvergne, his belly opened by a Francisca thrown at 20 paces, fighting for a Frankish count against a Visigothic raid that he had once been the kind of soldier sent to prevent. The throwing axe of the Franks, with its weighted head and short curved handle, was designed to be hurled in volleys before a charge. It hit shields, split them, then hit men. The man on the ground tasted copper and saw the sky narrow into a small bright circle and then close. Or he died of dysentery in the tents outside a siege, voiding himself into the same trench he had dug a week earlier. Procopius, writing the wars in the 540s and 550s AD, describes the conditions in the army camps of Belisarius during the reconquest of Italy. Men lay on straw soaked in their own filth. The flies came in clouds. The water from the river ran brown with the runoff from the latrines uphill. Disease killed more soldiers in those years than the Ostrogoths ever did. Or he was quietly executed in a courtyard at his own lord's order because he had become inconvenient, because he knew too much about the road south, because his sword arm had aged out, and his upkeep was now an expense without return. Gregory of Tours fills his Historia Francorum with stories of such men. Counts who served a king for 30 years and were strangled in their beds when a new heir took the throne. Warriors whose loyalty was rewarded with a quiet evening visit from two younger men with knives. He died with the iron taste in his mouth and no last words worth recording. No chronicle wrote down his name. And here is the cruelty buried at the bottom of the story. The greatest product Rome ever manufactured, the disciplined professional soldier, was perfectly calibrated to thrive inside the collapse of the system that built him. He did not need Rome. Rome had needed him. When the city stopped paying, he found someone who would. When the eagle fell, he picked up another standard. When the language of power shifted from Latin to Frankish to Gothic to the slow Romance dialects that would become French and Spanish and Italian, his hands kept doing the same work. He did not survive the end of the Roman world. He built the next one out of its bones. The mounted knight in his mail hauberk, bound by personal oath to a lord whose grandfather was a Roman senator, is the direct descendant of the late Roman cataphract who rode under Stilicho. The stone castle dominating the river is the direct descendant of the Roman castellum on the limes. The feudal contract of land in exchange for military service is the direct descendant of the bargain a starving veteran cut with a frightened landowner in the Auvergne around AD 480, when the roads went dark and the posts stopped coming. The Carolingian armies that Charles Martel led to victory at Tours in AD 732 were structured along lines a Roman tribune would have recognized. The capitularies of Charlemagne, issued from Aachen at the end of the 8th century AD, required every free man with a certain amount of land to appear for military service equipped with specific gear. The same way the Roman Republic had once organized its centuries by property class. The shadow of the legion stretched all the way to the gates of the medieval world. The army of Rome never died. It shattered into 1,000 fragments, and each fragment became a seed. And from those seeds, 1,000 years of medieval war grew up across the soil of Europe. The Norman knight at Hastings in AD 1066. The crusader who rode out of Clermont after Pope Urban II preached the First Crusade on November 27, AD 1095. The English man-at-arms standing in the mud at Agincourt on October 25, AD 1415. The Spanish tercio holding the line at Pavia on February 24, AD 1525. all of them tracing their lineage, whether they knew it or not, back to a cold night on a frontier wall, where a man with a worthless coin in his palm decided that the empire was finished and that he was not. The eagle fell. The men who had carried it did not. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this descent. If what we do here matters to you, if these stories deserve to keep being told the way they actually happened, take a moment to subscribe, leave a comment with the city and country you watched from, and pass this video along to someone who needs to see history without the polish. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Now, look at the screen. The next video is waiting there. Click it and walk further into the dark with us.